So for those of you who don't know, HudsonAlpha started in about 2007 as a biotech genomic research institute. So we have a number of faculty who do research just as you would in a university setting. And then we also have, I'll get to a bunch of the names later, but I want to say Dr. Sean Levy, who started the Genomic Services Lab, which is essentially from an infrastructure perspective, our primary customer. He runs all the sequencers, their lab runs all the sequencers in the institute. So they handle both internal customers and external customers. And then we're also opening up the Clinic for Genomic Medicine. We recruited Dr. Howard Jacob, and he, along with Dr. David Bick, are going to be doing more immediate research on, live genomic needs. So, the turnaround time for a lot of this stuff is no longer going to be research; it's actually clinical. And then you also add on to that all the HIPAA requirements. So there's a lot of stuff happening right now that are changing a lot of our needs. So, the idea behind this talk was to kind of say, so this institute started not long ago and started with a bunch of researchers that didn't really have much of an understanding of compute on the back end, and so there's been an interesting history with where we've come. So this slide, so we have. Give me a second here to get back where I wanted to go with this. So I don't want to talk too much about compute and bandwidth. I want to talk mostly about storage. Obviously, compute and bandwidth is a big part of everything we do. We currently have 10 gig Ethernet infrastructure that's more than enough for the type of stuff we do. The genomic data actually isn't. What's more interesting about it is the data profile, not necessarily the mass of data that it is, and how we are able to ingest that. Scaling compute is a function of how fast we need the answer. As I was saying, we now are going to need the answer a lot sooner than we have in the past, and so that's going to require our compute nodes to scale, and they are. We're roughly doubling every year, both in the amount of data we're generating and the compute capacity that we need. So our current compute cluster is about 20 teraflops, and we've just brought on the new Haswell processors with 6 instructions per cycle versus 4, which has hugely improved our performance per node. And we're also virtualizing a lot of it because of our profile. It requires a lot more flexibility with how we use our compute nodes. So by virtualizing it, we get a lot more. We can specify each run that we do. So yeah, we produce about 3 terabytes of data from the sequencers daily, about 7.5 as end product that goes back into GPFS. So the architecture that I sort of was working on when I started there was that we had these 3 key needs. We have our server infrastructure, we have the results from all of our compute that the researchers do, and then we have the raw sequencer data. And the problem is that we had them all siloed, and we also didn't have any resilient. We had resiliency within the same systems, but we didn't have redundancy in each of those stacks. So making those redundant obviously then costs money, right? So you have to make each one of those systems. You have to buy another system for it that's similar. So instead, the direction we went is we brought all this stuff under one stack with 2 separate redundant systems so that we can operate from one without going down and take the other one offline for maintenance as needed. So I'll get into this a little bit later. Further a little bit later. So our storage journey. So in the beginning, desktop NASs. So it really was, you had sequencers, old generation sequencers from 8 years ago, writing data to desktop NASs, and you had your compute running from people's laptops and a couple high performance workstations. And that was really how they got the work done. And then obviously, when you start to scale this out, it's not manageable, it's siloed, you can't, everything that's bad about it. So then, starting to get serious, Scott Newberry is one of our programmers, computer scientists. And when he joined the Myers lab, a lot of this stuff came out of the labs sort of growing organically. And Dr. Reedy, who's now with Duke, the two of them decided that it was time to move on from desktop NASs, and they bought a DCS 9900. They also bought a bunch of compute that went with that, a ZFS file system for landing sequencer data, and then there was also the IT team bought an EMC product for user files, and we had this all these systems that were siloed, but it worked. The sequencers wrote their data to ZFS. It was NFS imported to compute. Compute would write it back to GPFS, and then you would ultimately get it out to the customers via an NFS cluster. We then expanded. It says 3 petabytes on there. We expanded with the 12K20E. This is just before I arrived. That was only about 1 petabyte at the time, but we had it under one file system, and that was great. And then over the, as we kept growing, we expanded that from 1 to 2 to 3 petabytes. And then we wanted to retire the 9900 because it was a power hog. And so we got ready to retire it, and then we bought the high-seq X's, the X10s. And when we tried to put all their data onto our ZFS solution, it didn't really work too well. And that's not actually so much a problem with ZFS as it is a problem with the data profile coming off the high-seq X's. So it's hundreds of thousands of files, very, very small files, coming off of each sequencer. And so what we ended up doing is working with DDN. We brought the 9900 back into service. We put a file system on it, and we put DDN's new Samba clustering solution on the front end of it. And that worked better than the ZFS solution, but it still started to run into some problems. When we were doing this, the 9900 is a relatively small file system. After 4 months of data, we had written roughly 350 terabytes. This is just at the beginning when we had started writing data to it. And we were already at 400 million inodes. So with 350 terabytes of data. And that just tells you what the data profile is coming off the high-seq X's. So the Samba clusters, they work, but they definitely have some problems. So and again, it has to do with the data profile, not necessarily and how that works with Samba. So this works very well when you attach a desktop NAS to each sequencer, and it has a dedicated NAS to handle that file load. And so ultimately, but that's not manageable. So ultimately what we ended up doing is, as we scaled out the high-seq X's, we had to build additional independent clusters that use the same shared backend, but essentially gave each sequencer its own front-end device, but still giving the resiliency that we needed within those clusters. So, and then we expanded again, and we got an XE, and now we've gotten to the point where I wanted to get to, where we can finally retire the 9900, and we have 2 file systems. And then from that, we have each one in a separate data center in a separate building on our campus. And we have our compute, which has expanded greatly over the years. And we have our VM infrastructure, and we're virtualizing more and more as we move through this. But this also, we have, so this includes, and then we have our sequencers and our customers. So what I wanted to get to is, so we have the compute is all attached to GPFS. We have NFS clusters that we have separate for each file system on the front end. So it's one GPFS cluster, but we have separate NFS clusters on the front end, and we can store our VMs on those. And then we have separate SMB clusters, and there's actually multiple clusters on the front end of each. to target with our sequencers. And then we also put some native GPFS mounts on some transfer servers that we can no longer, we used to get all of our customer data out of the cluster and onto the websites for download via our NFS clusters, but we actually were denial of surfacing our VMs by doing that. So we had to segregate our VMs onto their own NFS clusters in order to get this to work properly. And with these transfer servers, they're actually much faster. NFS wasn't keeping up. So, and then the other thing, by putting this all into the file systems directly, you eliminate that transfer need. So before, when we were landing it into a separate file system, you would then have to use NFS to copy all that data over and run it against the compute and then store it on GPFS. So again, it's the same thing that everybody's saying. You know, moving data around, it takes time, and that's a huge cost. So so with this, we put sequencing data from our multiple sequencers. We load balance across the two file systems. This also helps with the data profile that comes off the HiSeq by putting them to separate file systems through separate clusters. And then that data is processed and transferred out, and our customers can download it. We also place VMs on redundant file systems. Those are backed up on each local file system. And we have, what I wanted to say here also is our Windows DRS for files are also on here. So we have essentially, even though it's not an ideal design, we have large VMDKs on the back of some Windows file systems. Those are then replicated between the two large GPFS file systems. And you have file redundancy for just basic Office user files without having the need for large separate systems that you have to buy redundantly. So, so we back those up locally. We copy the backups to the alternate file systems, and then we also keep VMs replicated into the alternate file systems as warm standbys. So we can operate, if we need to take one file system down for maintenance, we can switch over to its warm standby in a replay file, and then replay that file back to the original file system when we bring it back up. So we can run all our infrastructure, run all of our sequencer data, landing pads to these, and do all of our compute against them. So the next step is going to be figuring out the archiving system and how we want to retain this data. So there's already, you know, with all the HIPAA requirements and with medical genomic analysis, we're going to need to store this stuff for a while. We know that. Instead of just continuing to grow out these systems in the production environment, we need to have some sort of object storage, although it's not that much cheaper than our primary systems because these are designed for large storage. They're not designed for speed necessarily, and they more than do the job with the total spindle count. But we need to move off to some sort of archiving system so that we can also have a delineation point where we say these files are now archived, and you know the timeline starts for the data retention policy that they're going to be kept for. So moving those off, but still on the primary campus, and then building out that object storage as we need and as we go through the years of building data, or, you know, accumulating data, and then coming up with an alternate campus and doing replication of that data to an alternate campus. So that's where we are. So yeah, I definitely want to mention names. Compute and storage team. Obviously, I don't do any of this by myself. Behn McNully is our director of IT. Josh Nielsen is one of our HPC admins who does a lot of the deployment of our new HPC equipment. Scott and Scott are the IT guys that did handle the old EMC systems and a lot of the systems that run the Institute. And then the informatics group, we have Dr. Worthy, who now runs that, Scott and Gary, who did a large portion of our pipeline for handling the genomic analysis off the sequencers to finished product. And then obviously within the Genomic Services Lab, there's Dr. Levy, who runs it, and Dan Dorsett, who's the running their pipeline. They also have, what I didn't talk about was they also have Edico cards, Dragon cards, and we now have those directly attached with GPFS, and the performance is vastly improved over their NFS mount that they had used to import the data into local SSDs, then run the compute and push it back out. So now they just have native GPFS mounts on those. So yeah, a lot of stuff. Tried to get through it quickly. If you have any questions,